The land lay quiet when Elias Boone first set eyes upon it, the kind of silence that carries not peace but warning. The old ranch crouched against the horizon like a wounded animal, timbers sagging, fence posts leaning as if ashamed of themselves. The price had been $22, money scraped from the bottom of a tin box that once held his mother's sewing needles. Folks in town laughed when they heard he'd bought it. Boone's traded pride for dust, they said, the words slipping like burrs into his mind as he rode toward the broken gate. He had pictured a place of beginnings, something to steady a life that felt too long tethered to drifting wages and other men's orders. Instead, the air here smelled of old smoke and something fouler, something that carried on the wind like sorrow that refused to fade. His horse stamped uneasily, ears pricked toward the barn. Elias dismounted, boots grinding against the gravel, each step toward the dark doorway weighted by a dread he couldn't name. Inside, the gloom swallowed him whole. Dust motes drifted like faint spirits in the slant of light through cracked boards. And then, sound. A creak, slow and rhythmic, as if the barn itself were breathing. His eyes adjusted, and the shape revealed itself. Rope. Rope and a body hanging, swaying gently in the stale air. Elias staggered back, a curse half formed on his lips. Not a body, no, not yet. The girl moved, barely, the faint twitch of feet brushing the dirt. Her wrists were bound cruelly, her skin torn where the fibers bit in. Her hair, black as wet coal, hung forward across her face, but the low rasp of breath escaped her lips like a plea. For a moment he froze. His mind filled with the warnings of neighbors, the mutterings about Apache raids, the bitterness that spread like wildfire in saloons when the subject arose. To touch her, to help her, would be to mark himself in their eyes. He had bought a ranch to stand as a man among men, not to stoop into scandal. Yet the longer he stared, the clearer it became that if he turned away now, he would be walking out of this barn smaller than he had ever been. With hands shaking, Elias drew his knife and cut the rope. The girl fell into his arms, light as a bird but heavy with the weight of what had been done to her. She coughed, body arching, breath clawing its way back into her chest. He laid her down in the straw, pressing fingers against her throat until he felt the faint tremor of life. His heart hammered louder than the barn's silence. The hours that followed blurred. He fetched water, wetting her lips, though she pushed his hand away at first. He cut the bindings at her wrists, wincing at the rawness of her skin. When he draped his coat across her shoulders, she flinched as though expecting another blow. They spoke no words. She would not look at him. But as the night came on and the barn filled with the chill of desert air, her breathing steadied, and she did not try to flee. By dawn, Elias had carried her into the ranch house. The place was near ruin, boards loose, hearth cold, but it was shelter. He settled her near the window where morning light spilled across her bruised features. For the first time, he saw her eyes. Dark, watchful, untamed. She held his gaze for only a moment before turning away, but that moment lodged itself deep inside him, sharper than any blade. He stepped outside, hoping the sky would clear his thoughts. Instead, he saw dust trails rising from the road, riders heading back toward town. He knew what would follow, whispers, questions, judgments spoken in low voices that carried further than shouts. Already, his purchase had been a subject of ridicule, now it would become a scandal. Boone, harboring a savage on his land. The words formed themselves before anyone spoke them. Later that day, he ventured into town for supplies, flour, bandages, a bit of salt pork. The mercantile grew hushed when he entered. Men leaned against counters, pretending to busy themselves while their eyes cut sideways at him. The storekeep's smile was thin, his hands reluctant as he took Elias's coins. One man snorted aloud, muttering just loud enough, Boone's found himself cheaper company than cattle. Laughter, low and mean, followed. Elias kept his head down, shame burning his chest hotter than whiskey ever had. The ride home stretched long beneath the weight of those voices. The ranch seemed smaller when he reached it, as if it too had heard the ridicule. He half feared she would be gone, vanished into the wilderness, leaving him with only rope marks on the barn beams to remind him of what he'd done. But she was there, sitting by the cracked window, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The light touched her face, softening the harshness of bruises, and though she did not smile, she did not turn away when he entered. Elias stopped in the doorway, uncertain, the supplies heavy in his arms. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke now, though he had left no fire lit. She had tended to it, then. That small act, unnoticed by anyone else, struck him deeper than the cruelest laughter in town. Something stirred in his chest, an ache, a question, a warning. The silence between them held steady, not hostile but heavy, like two stones pressed together by the same river current. He knew the world outside would not forgive this. He knew shame would dog him worse than before. Yet standing in that dim light, watching her watch him, Elias felt for the first time that the ranch he had bought for $22 was no longer empty. The land had given him not the promise of prosperity, but a burden he could not lay down. And perhaps, though he dared not believe it yet, something more than a burden. The days that followed moved like the slow crawl of a shadow across the plains. Elias Boone kept to his work with a stubborn rhythm, splitting wood, mending fence rails, shoring up the roof that threatened collapse with each gust of wind. Yet the true work, the work that unsettled him most, lay not in hammer or axe but in the silent figure who shared his walls. The Apache girl, Nayeli, he had heard one of the men mutter her name on a drunken night in town, moved through his space like a wary spirit. She never spoke, never asked, but her hands left traces of quiet order behind her, a cup rinsed and set neatly on the shelf, a rag hung to dry by the hearth, kindling stacked tighter than he had ever bothered to arrange. At first Elias tried to ignore it, tried to live as though she were not there. But each small act tugged at him, made his solitude less empty, less safe. He would find her watching the land through the cracked window, shoulders rigid, eyes trained on the horizon as though expecting pursuit. At night he heard her breathing in the loft above, steady and alive, and that sound cut through his loneliness sharper than any prayer. The town did not let him forget. When he rode in for nails or flour, the stares grew longer, the mutters crueler. One morning outside the blacksmith's, a man spat at his boots. "You think she won't bring the rest of her kind down on you? Boone, you've got rocks in your head or poison in your blood." Elias said nothing. He had learned long ago that a man's silence can bruise worse than his fists. Still, shame trailed him back home like dust on his coat. That evening, Nayeli met his eyes for the first time since the barn. Her face bore no expression, but in her gaze he saw the faintest echo of what he carried, contempt from others, the weight of survival, the quiet wish to be seen without scorn. They were strangers bound by the same rope of judgment, two outcasts strung against the world's sneer. Something passed between them in that silence, not comfort, but recognition. It was recognition tested soon enough. The riders came at dusk, 4 of them, reeking of whiskey and horse sweat. Elias heard them before he saw them, their laughter coarse, their spurs jangling like iron teeth. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle leaning near the door but not yet in his hands. The men reined up, their horses restless in the falling light. "You got something doesn't belong to you, Boone," one called, grinning wide. "We're here to collect." Another spat, eyes glinting. "That Apache filth don't deserve your roof. We'll take her off your hands. Make it easier for everybody." Elias said nothing. His throat tightened, his palms damp. He felt the weight of years of shame pressing him down, the jeers from town echoing in their voices. To give her up would be to step back into that barn and leave her swinging. To stand his ground would be to risk the only shred of safety he had clawed together. The leader nudged his horse forward. "Move aside, Boone. Don't make this hard. You ain't got the spine for it." Elias's hand closed around the rifle. He lifted it slow, not with the swagger of a gunfighter, but with the grave steadiness of a man who had run out of places to hide. His voice, when it came, was low. "She stays." The air changed. The rider's laughter thinned, their bravado wavered against the quiet certainty in his tone. No shouting, no drawn guns, only the heavy silence of men measuring one another in the fading light. One cursed under his breath, another shifted uneasily in the saddle. At last the leader spat into the dirt. "Rot with her, then." With a jerk of his reins, he turned, and the others followed, their silhouettes fading into the dusk like bad memories. Elias stood there long after the sound of hooves had gone. His hands shook when he lowered the rifle, but the trembling carried something new, not just fear, but release. Behind him, he heard the door creak. Nayeli stood in the threshold, her face unreadable. She did not thank him, did not speak, but she stepped forward, pressed a scrap of cloth into his hand. It was his shirt, patched where it had torn across the sleeve. Her stitches were tight, steadier than his own. That night the house felt different. The silence between them was no longer empty but thick with unspoken understanding. He lit a small fire, and she did not retreat to the loft but sat across from him, her gaze steady in the glow. They said nothing, yet Elias felt as though they had spoken volumes. He saw her not as a burden, nor as a mark of shame, but as someone who, like him, bore scars invisible to others. When dawn came, Elias walked the ranch's boundary lines. The land was still broken, fences leaning, soil dry, but he no longer saw only ruin. He saw ground waiting to be tended, a place where two outcasts might carve dignity from dust. As the sun rose higher, Nayeli joined him, her steps light but sure beside his. They walked in silence, the horizon wide before them. Elias thought of the $22 he had spent, the ridicule he had carried, the rope he had cut. What he held now was heavier, stranger, more precious than any land deed. He glanced at her, and for the first time, she did not look away. The wind stirred the grass, carrying no laughter, no jeers, only the quiet promise of something unbroken yet. Elias let the moment settle into him, a weight both terrifying and holy. The ranch was no longer empty, and neither was he.